So now to discuss the latest from Armenia and what's going on there, we are delighted to welcome Dominik Cagara, co-founder and director, OC Media. Welcome to the program. Good to have you.
Hello.
Now, Dominik, I want to jump right into these protests. We're seeing them now for a few days on the streets, and a particular individual, the Archbishop, Mr. Bagrat Galstanyan, who very much has been one of those prominent faces. And I think behind that, we're seeing that he's actually trying to push in a sort of impeachment process of the Prime Minister of Armenia. So tell us a little bit how this has come about. Can that be successful? What's involved? Give us the latest.
To start with, there is a big disgruntlement in Armenian society about the role of Pashinyan's government. Pashinyan has been in power already for several years. During his rule, Armenia lost control over Nagorno-Karabakh. There is a deep feeling of frustration and the feeling that Armenia lost all sort of negotiating power with Azerbaijan mounting demands and Armenia having to concede to these demands. For example, unilateral handing over of the contested villages to Azerbaijan within the demarcation process and in order to sign the peace agreement.
We're just going to interrupt. I'm sorry, we want to share with our viewers and you some breaking news right now. We're hearing that right now that Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico has been shot and wounded at a government meeting near Bratislava. And of course, we'll cover more of that as we have the details. But just coming in now that the Prime Minister of Slovakia has been shot and wounded. I just want to share that with our audience and you right now. Right, let's go back to Armenia now. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but please do continue your point there. Really appreciate the interruption there, Dominik.
The protest movement, it has limited power, I would say. It's a manifestation of the lack of trust in the Armenian government. There is a feeling among the protesters that the government is betraying the interests of Armenian nation. That it's appeasing Azerbaijan in its very hardball policy towards Armenia. The prospects for impeachment are probably quite vague. I don't suspect this is something realistic, but given the lack of strong opposition otherwise to Pashinyan's rule, it's very difficult to predict how these protests can evolve.
I just wanted to follow up on that in light of what is happening in Georgia right now. Obviously, the two countries are quite closely located. Do you think that in light of what is happening in Georgia, that the Armenian events will somehow be inspired by that? Because obviously, the Russian influence in Armenia and the conflict with Azerbaijan is quite closely related.
I don't think that these two events, these mass demonstrations in Georgia and Armenia, are directly connected. There is a lot of internal dynamic at play, all inside Georgia and inside Armenia. Here on the ground, there is no feeling that these two are in any way connected. But it's true that Russia is a very strong player in the region. Russia has been trying for many, many years to restore its power over the entire South Caucasus. First of all, the current relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, can be viewed as the attempt of Russia to regain influence in Azerbaijan, to weaken...
But I'm sorry to interrupt you there. You said for Russia trying to gain more influence in Azerbaijan. I mean, very much, I think the Russians leaving, they were supposed to be there to prevent any sort of escalation of conflict. They have now, I think last month they left. So I think that was pretty much a failure of the Russians. So, I mean, is it really more of a, giving them more clout? I mean, I'd say the opposite. They're leaving and they're out, or am I interpreting that wrong?
No, Russians have been having difficult relations with Armenian government already for a long time. Right now, Armenia is trying to reorient its policy towards the West, seeing that Russia has betrayed Armenia, has betrayed all security guarantees Russia gave to Armenia, and de facto supporting Azerbaijan during the resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict definitely won a lot of points inside Azerbaijan. And I think this influence is going to grow, especially if Georgia continues to move to shift to the Russian sphere of influence, as we can see is happening right now, with Georgia de facto abandoning its pro-Western and EU integration direction yesterday with the adoption of the foreign agent law. With Georgia back into Russia's sphere of influence, the Russian influence in Azerbaijan can only grow.
But the two countries, Azerbaijan and Armenia, they have essentially been at conflict for decades now. Where do you see this current situation going?
I think that even with a peace agreement, there is no guarantee that any sort of new conflict won't escalate. The Azerbaijani rhetoric towards Armenia has been outward aggressive. Azerbaijan has multiple times voiced claims to territory that's de jure Armenian territory, such as the so-called Zangezur corridor connecting Azerbaijan with the exclave of Nakhchivan. But it's impossible to see, like, the situation is so fluid, like what exactly will happen. But one thing is clear, it seems that Russia is trying to reestablish its influence in the entire South Caucasus region in a sort of Pax Russica, where all three countries are subjugated to Russia.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think part of this whole idea of, as Maria's alluded to, I mean, there has been tension, there has been conflict between these nations, but I suppose one of the ideas here was that the peace agreement, the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, may potentially lead Armenia closer to better relations, not just with its neighbors, but also closer ties with the European Union. So is this something now, I mean, will that end goal now be closer as to this, or will internal and external pressures lead to more destabilization in Armenia?
It depends on many factors. First of all, the internal pressure inside Armenia that you mentioned. Second of all, the developments in Georgia, because with Georgia back into Russian sphere of influence, it will be increasingly difficult for Armenia to maintain meaningful relations with the West, whether politically or economically. It's also unclear how Turkey will behave in the future. An opening of the Turkish-Armenian border would probably be a game changer in the region. But if that doesn't happen, it might turn out that Armenia remains single pro-Western country in the region, like sandwiched between bigger neighbors, anti-authoritarian neighbors outright.
And one other question that I have is the 4 villages that are at play here. What happens to the people there?
There are not many people living in these villages. Like, these villages are practically abandoned. But probably if these villages are fully handed over to Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan will restore its control, and these people will need to be resettled. So far, there is no precedent of Azerbaijani community staying in de jure Armenia controlled territory or other way around.
Yeah, I mean, I think a very complex situation, very much fragile, and we're going to covering it, of course, as we have more information. Look, thank you so much, Dominik Cagara there. Appreciate your insights today.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.